Greetings. It is time for our monthly monetary creation report, which we do every month, which establishes the connection between technological deflation, money printing, and how so much money printing does not cause inflation on top of the exponential nature of technological progress and thus exponential deflation. So as always, we go to this Yardeni report and we scroll down. The four major central banks of the world, the U.S. Federal Reserve is the red line and is responsible for only 8.2 trillion of this total. The other lines are the European Central Bank, People's Bank of China, and Bank of Japan. And so the U.S. is less than 1/3 of all total money printing. A lot of people in the United States who have gone utterly hysterical about the concept of money printing say things like the Federal Reserve has printed so much money, therefore gold will rise in price, even though gold is a worldwide price commodity and the U.S. is but one country that is doing less than 1/3 of the money printing. Their tacit assumption is that the U.S. is the only country in the world. Now, money printing is borderless because technological disruption is also borderless. Therefore, only the grand total of these four central banks matter. They comprise about 85 to 90% of all the world's money printing, not 100%, but the vast majority of the world's money printing. And therefore, the grand total is what we'll see next, and that is represented by this chart over here. Notice this exponential increase in the amount of money printing that these central banks have had to do just to avoid crises. And now they're deprinting again, but they've been meandering for the last several months. Some are printing, some are deprinting. It's in a stable status quo, and that is why conditions are deteriorating. Inflation is going down more and more, and the stock market has not corrected yet, but the stock market may correct when it wants more printing because the technonomic medium of the world is intelligent. So $27.1 trillion of cumulative money printing, of which only 8.2 trillion was the United States. Now this was going exponentially, as I said, and it really needs to be over here based on exponential technology, not down here. So we are already a good 10 or 12 trillion dollars behind from where we should be, and to catch up within, say, a year or two, we would have to be over here, above the upper limit of this chart, just to maintain this exponential trend. Some people say this is linear, but it's not linear because technology is exponential, and the percentage of the economy that is comprised of high technology is rising, as you can learn about in this video up here in this upper right hand corner. So I believe we will revert back to this situation over here. Unless the central banks of the world have found a way to print money that is not even on the balance sheet. That way they avoid scrutiny and avoid the people who are complaining a lot about the balance sheet. There's some early indications that there may be a possibility there. I'm not going to bring those up yet because there's not enough data, but we have to be prepared for that reality as well, where the central banks are printing even more money than this, and that's why the stock market's not correcting, because there's a political necessity to print money without it appearing on the balance sheet. But we will know the answer to that in coming months. Now, I have always maintained that the growth rate of this cumulative amount of money printing has to be 16 to 24% a year just to offset technological deflation. So what is the year-over-year growth rate of this exact curve? That is the next chart. This is the percentage year-over-year growth rate, and the 16 to 24% band is around here. It is rarely above this band. Only once, February 2021, did it go to 46.3%, and that is when even I thought there could be brief inflation, and maybe that contributed a little bit to the very temporary inflation that we saw in late 2021 and early 2022. But in general, it's usually below this band. This should be an optimal band of money printing, and right now it's at minus 5.9% as a growth rate. It should be plus 16, but it's minus 5.9. These peaks are negated by these troughs, and the equilibrium being here means that the 10 or 12 trillion dollar deficit of printing that I mentioned a minute ago would bring the growth rate back up to here if it were to be done. So we're already behind in the amount of money printing. We're also behind in the type of money printing, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But this growth rate has to be back up here so that this line of total printing is back over here. And now we go to the next chart that we often look at in this Yardeni report. This is the same four central banks on the same color code as before, and how much they have printed as a percentage of their annual GDP. And yes, this money printing is cumulative, while GDP is an annual metric, but at least you can compare these four central banks to each other under a uniform metric. As you can see, the United States is the joint lowest of the four, only 31.4% of its GDP in money printing, the same as China. Why China has stopped printing, I'm not sure, but then again, they might be the ones who are printing in an off-balance sheet manner. Europe has done 56.2% of its GDP in money printing. And by Europe, I mean the Eurozone, the currency bloc that uses the euro. They're deprinting quite a bit, which they should not be doing, but at least they got this high. So they are more aggressive about money printing. You think Germans are the people most afraid of money printing, but they got over their outdated fears much better than the US has. The US is still hamstrung by those conservatives and libertarians who have worldviews that are between 70 and 110 years out of date from a fiscal and monetary perspective. But the big winner is the Bank of Japan, which has done twice again as much as Europe. Japan has done an incredible 125% of its GDP in money printing. Now, why they're deprinting, I don't know, because they were brave enough to do this, and that did not harm either their country or the rest of the world. Because money printing is global in nature, that is why all of Japan's money printing does not cause local inflation in Japan, because that printing is going into the US and offsetting the shortage of money printing in the US. And even the people who claim that the US is experiencing hyperinflation, but they can't put forth any credible data to that effect, even those people don't claim Japan has high inflation. So this chart alone proves that those people don't know what's going on. Japan could print 4 times as much money as the United States in proportion to the size of its economy, yet it does not have inflation. That proves that my thesis has a lot of merit, and this is the reason for a lot of my predictions having been accurate, which they have been, and longtime viewers will vouch for that. Now, we'll go to one more chart over here that we usually don't go to. This chart, which takes that worldwide total that we saw before, the blue line, and the S&P 500. Normally, these two things are very closely correlated, but now they have decoupled for some reason. Even though deprinting is going on, the S&P 500 is this high, when it should be around here just based on the amount of deprinting. It should be in the 3,700 range, not the 4,400 range. And there's also dividends within this as well. And this is where we see deprinting for the first time decoupling from stock market performance. Is this just momentum about optimism and a technological boom? Or is there a new type of money printing that is not on balance sheets that is being done, which we don't know about yet? That is a question we will find out about soon. Now we go to my 2020's QE scorecard. So longtime viewers know that on January 1st, 2020, I said the amount of quantitative easing money printing, whatever its form, done in the 2020s would be $50 to $100 trillion over the course of this decade. $50 trillion if done in terms of cash sent directly to people, which would have higher velocity of money and more diffusion. 100 trillion if done in the way that it's being done now, which is bond buying. 50 to 100 trillion. And the PhD economists of the Western world, mostly the US, but there's also a strange bunch of European economists who still think that all money printing can be reversed and somehow this will not cause any type of problem. They believe all of the money printing of the 2010s decade, which was 23 trillion, as we saw, will be reversed. So their prediction for the 2020s is negative minus 23 trillion. That's what they thought on January 1st, 2020, because that's their ongoing belief about money printing. Whereas I was very vocal about how the amount of money printing will be plus 50 to 100 trillion. And where are we as of August 20th, 2023? So more than 1/3 of the way through this 10-year period. We're at plus $8.7 trillion. Now, which is the more likely accurate prediction? Mine of plus 50 to 100 trillion, or theirs, minus 23 trillion. It's certainly moving in a direction consistent with my prediction. Plus, this is exponential in nature. That's why much more will be done in the second half than the first half. Even if we're only halfway to this number by 2027 or 28, that's fine, because 29 and 30 will catch up. And then the 2030s will have an amount of money printing far higher than even the numbers we are talking about over here. At some point, I'll do a video about the economy of the 2030s, which is not that far away. We're talking about a decade that is 7 to 17 years away over its entire duration. It begins 7 years from now. But this is how wrong these PhD economists are, and they don't care that they're wrong. They have no incentive to make accurate predictions and no penalty for being inaccurate. They just repeat textbooks that they memorized. They're only evaluated by people who read the same textbook books, and since they're all wrong, in relative terms, none of them are wrong. Now here's why cash directly to people matters, because the way money printing is done in the United States is only buying two things, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. So that causes a hyper distortion in those two markets. Almost half of all mortgages in the United States are owned by the Federal Reserve. So people who own houses keep on making home equity, and the bigger of a house you have, the more home equity you are making, whereas people who don't have a house are shut out of that. Similarly, by buying treasuries, they are enabling the U.S. government to expand spending by more and more and to run bigger and bigger deficits. If this was deliberately done to concentrate wealth among very few people, then it is effective. But if it was meant to help all people, or even help average people, not even the bottom tier of people, but average people, you could hardly invent a more distortive and ineffective way to print money, because this is analogous to trying to fill a bucket with water by keeping a bucket 6 feet away from a sink on the ground and then overflowing the sink and having the water flow out of the sink onto the floor and hope that some droplets splash into the bucket. If they really wanted to help the human condition, this is how ineffective of a job they're doing. Sending cash directly to people and offsetting income tax by the same amount is the direction all market forces are going in, because if you're worried about automation and AI taking away human jobs, then you have to migrate taxation onto artificial intelligence in the form of a monetization of technological deflation, which leads to a dividend paid to people, which is what this money printing should comprise of. And I wrote my Atom publication 7.5 years ago. If you're new here, you should read that entire publication or watch my Google talk about this subject. Longtime viewers are familiar with this, and all market forces are going in the direction that I have been predicting for quite a long time. Now, we go to part 2 of this video, which is an assessment of inflation, especially since an entire cottage industry has emerged devoted to lying about inflation being much higher than it actually is, because some people want to live in a constant state of fear, so there is a receptive audience for people who want to sell to an audience that wants to believe inflation is much higher than it is. So we continue to part 2. And for this month's inflation update, we have my familiar matrix, where I have the 3%, 3%, 3% threshold that you see here. I say that all three of these numbers have to be above 3% for inflation to be structurally high. Until that point, quantitative easing, money printing is not excessive, and even if it's excessive only by the extent to which all three of these numbers are above 3%. To be at 3.1% would obviously just mean a very small excess. And these numbers are the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, which is more a measurement of forward inflation rather than past inflation, but it is extremely crucial for things like housing prices, rents, as well as how much money the U.S. federal government can spend in excess of taxes collected and be added to the national debt. And then the middle number here is the most important of the three, the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Why? Because it comprises of only freely traded commodities like oil, natural gas, silver, gold, etc. And it is international in nature, so everything from currency prices to the fact that some people claim that inflation indices are rigged to understate inflation, all of that is brushed aside with the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. And as we will see, this is the one indicating the lowest inflation of the three. That's why the claims that the US CPI understates inflation are fundamentally wrong, although that is something that inflation mongers like to believe, because their religion is to whine about inflation being high so that they can feel like victims. But the cold hard statistics and mathematical reality tell us something different. So let's go to the 10-year US Treasury yield first. 10-year US Treasury yield, 4.17%. That is quite a bit above 3%. It has only been above 3% for a short while. Now, it cannot stay very high for too long because this is very powerful negative pressure on the housing market as well as the price of US Treasuries. Therefore, this is exerting a lot of negative economic pressure, but 4.17%. Now we go to the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index 10-year compound annual growth rate is minus 0.72%. Minus 0.72%. It is in deflation. It is nowhere near 3%. As we know, the price of oil is lower than it was 10 years ago. The price of gold is about the same as it was 10 years ago. None of these things are in an inflationary mode, and that's why this commodity index is minus 7.2%. And I cannot state enough times that this is the most important measurement because commodities are indisputably a detractor from standards of living. When commodities are cheaper, human prosperity rises faster. When commodities are more expensive, human prosperity is obstructed. The same is not quite true for service prices, because with service prices, yes, the payer is paying more, but that's a one-for-one match for the service provider earning more as their compensation. If getting a haircut costs twice as much as it did 10 years ago, then the barber is also making twice as much, so their wage rose. So service sector inflation is simultaneous with wage increases. The only way the standard of living can in fact rise is if productivity rises, and the only way the standard of living can fall is if productivity falls. That's why service sector inflation is rather ambiguous about whether that is bad or good or something in between for those reasons. Now we go to the US CPI. So this is the bls.gov website, and the links for this and other websites will be in the description box below as always. And this is the CPI index. And so to see the 10-year compound annual growth rate, you take the most recent reading, which is 304, and then the reading exactly 10 years prior, which is 233, and that shows the inflation over 10 years, and you take the 10th root of that to see what the average growth rate was over the last 10 years on a per year basis. Now we can scroll through the various time windows for visual effect. 1 month change, you can see that that flurry of high inflation is now going further and further in the past. And the same is true in the 2-month window, the 3-month window, the 6-month window, and even the 12-month 1-year window. That inflation blip is receding into the past and is becoming more and more of a non-event when viewed from a big picture perspective. But I can put all this into a table that we are accustomed to seeing, so I'll go there. So the July 2023 reading has been inserted into this table. 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, and 6 months. So to get the annualized number, the 1 month is to the 12th power, the 2 month is to the 6th power, 3 months to the 4th power, 6 months to the 2nd power square, and so forth. And then for longer time windows than 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years, you take a root. Square root, cube root, 5th root, 10th root. And of course, the 1 year inflation rate is 3.3%. I had all kinds of weird commenters come over here and say that the 1 year inflation rate is the only one that matters. They said that, of course, when it was temporarily very high, as we just saw from those charts on the bls.gov website. But now that it is low, those same commenters are nowhere to be found because they're only interested in data that confirms what they want to believe, which is that inflation is high. Now they're finding some other weird data, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as you can see, the 10-year compound annual growth rate is 2.7%, and the 1 year is 3.3%, and there is no indication of inflation going high again. That little blip that we saw is receding into the past, and it resides between the 2 and 3 year window now. But it's not visible here, and it's not visible here, so does it even really matter? So now we go back to my scorecard. So we saw all three, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the most important of the three, and the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. So what are the readings that we just saw on August 12th, 2023? 2.7% for the U.S. CPI, minus 0.72% for the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. It is in deflation. The most important measurement of the three is in deflation. That is why money printing should be continued and ramped up. It should not be clamped down. And this is the only one that's above 3%. 4.17% for the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. This is bearish for the U.S. housing market as well as for the U.S. deficit spending scenario in terms of interest paid on deficit spending and the national debt. But only one of these numbers is above 3%, so it is not time to say that inflation is structurally high. And it's extremely difficult to make inflation structurally high because more money printing simply produces more technology, which then in turn causes more deflation. And that is why I've chosen these three measurements, because the higher this one gets, the harder it is for these two to become high, as a matter of fact. in this age of exponential technology. Now, in the last part of this video, we're going to go to another anecdotal measurement that seems to be given very outsized importance by people who are desperate to find inflation under every rock and in every breath of air. And we'll look at what is happening with that indicator. This is the Federal Reserve chart to indicate the price of eggs in the United States. And I feel silly even talking about this, but article upon article has been written about how the high price of eggs is crushing society and is the end of the world. And as we can see, the price of eggs was high for exactly 1 month, January of 2023. That was 6 months ago, and it was high for 1 month. The price of eggs rose very sharply and fell very sharply too, and now the price is once again the same as it was 15 years ago, and only twice what it was 43 years ago. So the price of eggs has doubled in 43 years, and that is somehow a crisis. I made this video up here in the right-hand corner about when the egg prices were very high and how I predicted that the prices would collapse totally, and of course my prediction turned out to be right, whereas the people, mostly inflation fearmongers and US conservatives and libertarians, insisted that this was a crisis that was like the oil crisis of 1973 or something. It was the end of the world. Now that egg prices have fallen, they're either nowhere to be found in some cases, or they insist that prices are still high, even though this graph says the opposite. Now, some of those people are just selling clickbaits to the lowest possible denominator audience, the type of audience that doesn't even know how to read graphs and charts, and they'll be able to keep saying the price of eggs is high for about 10 years. But that is really not the case. I had commenters over here write page-length comments about how the price of eggs matters more than the CPI or any index that weighs baskets of goods because don't you know that most people eat eggs? They just could not comprehend the concept of an index and did not have the mathematical ability to read any graph or chart. Now, there is a structural reason why the prices of eggs could rise slightly. Higher standards of egg production are being implemented into law in the United States because pasture-raised eggs are not only more humane, but have much higher nutritional content than those factory farm eggs, which is when a hen lives their entire life in a shoebox-sized enclosure, and therefore the nutritional quality of eggs produced suffers. And that's a problem with U.S. mass-produced food. They've gone for quantity, not quality, and at least there's some movement to revert back to quality, which is exerting some upward pressure on price, but you're getting a higher bang for the buck, I would say. But despite that, it's still only twice as high as it was 43 years ago. And I state again, as I stated in that egg production video from a few months ago, how many eggs are you actually eating? Is it really a large percentage of your expenses? Even if you're a bodybuilder, college student, it can't possibly be that large of an impact on your budget. If it is, you are one out of maybe 10,000 people. But this represented peak inflation scaremongering, and these people have not been cured of their insanity yet. That's why I did this 3-part video series you can see up here about how US conservatives and libertarians have utterly lost their minds about inflation, and they're not getting cured of this mental disorder. Because eggs were high in January 2023, they are still complaining about it, which makes about as much sense as complaining about how temperatures were high in the summer that was 6 years ago. There was a streak of 6 days that had high temperatures. I still can't get over that. That sounds silly, right? But whining about how eggs were expensive for 1 month, and you were denied as many omelets as you wanted to eat for 1 month, is truly insane. They just cannot accept that inflation is not high because they want to say that their hardship is for factors beyond their control, when in fact it has never been easier to make a lot of money than it is today. Now, if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.